February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima, Japan. The black volcanic sand stretched before him like a nightmare made solid. Private First Class. Thomas Begay crouched behind the ramp of the landing craft, feeling the vessel rock with each wave that slammed against its hull. Around him, Marines checked their weapons, adjusted their helmets, whispered prayers in languages from across America. Some spoke English, some spoke Spanish, and Thomas Begay spoke Navajo. He was 19 years old. He carried a rifle, a radio, and a secret that would help change the course of the Pacific War. As the ramp dropped and chaos erupted across that beach, Thomas would do something that seemed impossible. He would speak openly, transmitting military coordinates and tactical orders in his native language over radio frequencies the enemy could hear. And those enemy forces, despite having some of the best codebreakers in the world, would have absolutely no idea what he was saying. This is the story of the Navajo code talkers and other Native American warriors who served their country during World War II. Men who were punished for speaking their languages in childhood, only to have those same languages become America's most powerful secret weapon. This is the story of an unbreakable code that saved thousands of lives and helped win the war in the Pacific. Before we dive deeper into this incredible true story, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories to light. By late 1941, American military planners faced a crisis. The Japanese military had demonstrated an extraordinary ability to break encrypted communications. Every code the United States implemented, every cipher system deployed, the Japanese codebreakers managed to crack it, sometimes within hours. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was costing American lives. Japanese forces knew where ships would be, when attacks were planned, where troops would land. The element of surprise, so crucial to military operations, had become nearly impossible to achieve. Traditional encryption machines like the M209 converter were too slow for battlefield communications. By the time a message could be encoded, transmitted, and decoded, tactical situations had already changed. Soldiers needed real-time communication, but real-time meant the enemy could listen in. Then, in early 1942, a man named Philip Johnston walked into Camp Elliott, near San Diego, with an idea that seemed almost too simple to work. Johnston was the son of missionaries who had spent his childhood on the Navajo Nation. He was one of perhaps 30 non-Navajos in the entire world who could speak the language fluently, and he understood something that would prove crucial. The Navajo language was essentially impossible for outsiders to learn, and had never been written down in any systematic way. The Marines were skeptical. They'd experimented with Native American languages during World War I, when Choctaw soldiers had successfully confused German intelligence by transmitting messages in their tribal language. But World War II was different. The Japanese had studied American Indian languages after World War I, sending anthropologists to reservations throughout the 1920s and 1930s. They were prepared for this tactic, or so they thought. Johnston arranged a demonstration. Several young Navajo men were brought in to transmit mock tactical messages. Marine officers watched as messages that took hours to encode and decode with mechanical systems were transmitted and accurately received in under 3 minutes, using only spoken Navajo. The test was successful. Astonishingly successful. In May 1942, the Marine Corps authorized the recruitment of 29 Navajo men for a pilot program. These 29 young men would become known as the Original 29, the code talkers who would create the foundation of an unbreakable communications system. Chester Nez stood in a classroom at the Fort Defiance Indian School in Arizona when the Marine recruiter walked in. He was 21 years old, born in Chechilta, New Mexico, to the Black Sheep clan of the Sleeping Rock people. His real Navajo name wasn't Chester. That English name had been assigned to him when he was 8 years old, named after President Chester A. Arthur by Bureau of Indian Affairs officials who believed Native American names were too difficult for white teachers to pronounce. Chester's childhood had been difficult in ways that most Americans couldn't imagine. His mother died when he was 3. At age 8, he was taken from his grandmother's home and sent to government boarding school. There, speaking Navajo was strictly forbidden. Children caught speaking their native language were beaten. Their mouths were washed out with soap. They were humiliated in front of their classmates. The U.S. government's policy was clear. Erase native culture, erase native language, force assimilation into white American society. Chester learned to hide his language. He learned to speak English, but he never forgot Navajo. At night, lying in his bunk, he would recite the stories his grandmother had told him around the fire. Stories about changing woman, about the hero twins, about the creation of the Navajo people. He kept his language alive in his heart, even when speaking it out loud meant punishment. When the Marine recruiter explained that they were looking for men who were fluent in both Navajo and English, Chester didn't hesitate. Either you want to go or you don't want to go, he would recall decades later. I said, I'll go. For the Navajo people, warrior traditions ran deep. Despite centuries of persecution, despite the Long Walk of 1864, when the U.S. Army forced 8,000 Navajos to march 300 miles to internment at Bosque Redondo, despite decades of government policies designed to destroy their culture, the Navajo never stopped being warriors. When America called, they answered, not because America had treated them well, not because they had been granted full citizenship rights. They answered because defending the land, protecting the people, that was part of who they were. Chester Nez and 28 other young Navajo men reported to Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego, in May 1942. They formed Recruit Training Platoon 382. They endured the same brutal boot camp as every other Marine recruit. They ran the same obstacle courses, fired the same weapons, learned the same discipline. But they also carried something unique. They carried a language that would become a weapon. After boot camp, the 29 were transferred to Camp Elliott, California. There, in a secured classroom, they received their mission: create an unbreakable code using the Navajo language. The task before the original 29 was more complex than simply translating English to Navajo. They needed to create a 2-layer encryption system that would be fast, accurate, and impossible to break. The first layer addressed the English alphabet. Since many military terms would need to be spelled out or said letter by letter, they assigned Navajo words to each of the 26 letters. But they went further. To make the code even more difficult to break, they created multiple Navajo words for frequently used letters. The lettera could be represented by 3 different Navajo words: Wolachi, ant; Belasana, apple; or Sinil, axe. This meant that even if an enemy intercepted the same message transmitted twice, the words would be different. The second layer tackled military terminology. Modern warfare used hundreds of specific terms that had no equivalent in Navajo: fighter planes, submarines, destroyers, grenades. These concepts didn't exist in traditional Navajo life. So the code talkers created metaphors rooted in the natural world they knew. A battleship became Lotso, whale. A submarine became Beshlo, iron fish. A destroyer was Kalo, shark. Fighter planes were assigned bird names. Dahetihai meant hummingbird for fighter plane. Guinea meant chicken hawk for dive bomber. Tsidi meant bird for aircraft in general. Military ranks received similar treatment. A major general became Sonaki, 2 stars. A colonel was Atsa, silver eagle. Even simple concepts like attack became Alta Hashtai, and retreat became Jidin Neschan. The brilliance of the system extended beyond just vocabulary. The Navajo language itself provided built-in encryption. Navajo is a tonal language, meaning the same word spoken with different tones can have completely different meanings. It uses glottal stops, nasal sounds, and linguistic structures that don't exist in Indo-European languages. Its grammar is so complex that linguists estimate it takes the average non-native speaker at least 5 years of immersion to achieve basic fluency. More importantly, the Navajo language had never been systematically written down. There was no Navajo dictionary for Japanese intelligence to consult, no grammar textbook to study, no Rosetta Stone to provide translation. The language existed primarily in oral tradition, passed down through generations of storytelling and ceremony. Over several intense weeks, the original 29 developed and memorized the initial code, which contained 211 vocabulary terms. This would later expand to over 400 terms as the war progressed and new military technology emerged. But here's the crucial point. Nothing was written down. Every code talker had to memorize the entire system. Every word, every alternative, every encryption method had to be committed to memory. If a code talker was captured, there could be no code book for the enemy to find. The Navajo men brought unique skills to this memorization challenge. They'd grown up in an oral tradition where stories, histories, songs, and sacred knowledge were transmitted entirely through memory. Chester Nez could recall entire ceremonies his grandfather had taught him, word for word, tone for tone. That same capacity for memorization now served a different purpose. In July 1942, Marine officers conducted the final test. A mock battle scenario was set up. Messages would be transmitted using both traditional encryption methods and the new Navajo code. The results were stunning. Using the M209 cipher machine, a 3-line tactical message required 4 hours to encode, transmit, and decode. The same message, transmitted in Navajo code, took 20 seconds. And it was completely accurate. No errors, no hesitation, no mistakes. The Marines were convinced the Navajo code was approved for combat use. Now came the hardest part, actually using it in battle, where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. In November 1942, Chester Nez found himself aboard a transport ship heading toward Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Marines had been fighting there since August, brutal jungle warfare against an enemy that refused to surrender. The island was soaked in blood and rain, a hell of mud, disease, and constant combat. Chester and 5 other code talkers were assigned to the 1st Marine Division. They worked in pairs. One operated the radio, the other transmitted and received messages. Japanese forces were listening to every radio transmission. Their intelligence officers hunched over receivers, desperately trying to understand what they were hearing. Chester's first combat transmission came during an artillery strike. A Marine forward observer had spotted a Japanese machine gun nest that was pinning down an infantry advance. The observer radioed the coordinates to Chester's position. Chester translated the English message into Navajo code, memorizing the military grid coordinates, the target description, and the urgency level. Then he spoke into the radio. To any listener, it sounded like gibberish, a string of seemingly unrelated words in a language they had never heard. But to the Navajo code talker receiving the message at the artillery command post, every word was crystal clear. He rapidly decoded the message, translated it to English, and relayed it to the artillery officer. Seconds later, American artillery opened fire. The shells landed precisely on target. The Japanese machine gun position disappeared in explosions of earth and fire. The infantry advance continued. Chester later recalled the moment. The first message I sent over the radio while serving at Guadalcanal was, "Enemy machine gun nest on your right. Destroy." It was destroyed right away. The pride in his voice, even decades later, was unmistakable. But combat wasn't just about radio transmissions. The code talkers were Marines first, code talkers second. They carried rifles, they stood watch, they dug foxholes and strung communication wire under enemy fire. And they faced the same horrors as every other Marine on that island. Japanese forces launched banzai charges, human wave attacks, where soldiers screamed and charged directly into machine gun fire. Chester watched men die, saw friends torn apart by shrapnel, smelled the sickening odor of bodies decomposing in the tropical heat. The jungle itself seemed hostile. Insects carried malaria and dengue fever. Rain turned foxholes into swamps, and the darkness was so complete that Marines couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. Yet the code held. The Japanese intercepted every transmission, recorded them, analyzed them, brought in their best linguists and code breakers. They got nowhere. The language was simply too foreign, too different from anything in their experience. One Japanese intelligence officer, after listening to recordings of Navajo code transmissions, described it as the strange sounds of a bird or animal. As word of the code talkers' success spread, more Navajo men were recruited. The program expanded from 29 to 200, then to over 400. A formal training school was established at Camp Elliott to train new code talkers. Everyone had to pass the same rigorous standards. Fluent in both Navajo and English, physically capable of serving as a Marine, and able to memorize the entire code system without notes or aids. Thomas Begay hit the beach at Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, as part of the first wave of the assault. He was assigned to the 5th Marine Division, and his job was to coordinate between the beach command post and the naval vessels providing fire support offshore. As Marines died around him, as Japanese artillery and machine gun fire swept across the volcanic sand, Thomas set up his radio and began transmitting. For the first 2 days of the Iwo Jima battle, 6 Navajo code talkers worked around the clock. They transmitted over 800 messages. Every single message was delivered accurately, without a single error. Coordinates for artillery strikes, requests for medical evacuation, reports of enemy positions, orders for tactical movements, all transmitted in Navajo, all received and decoded perfectly. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer, would later make a statement that captured the code talkers' importance. Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Think about what that means. Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Nearly 7,000 Americans died taking that 8-square-mile island. Almost 20,000 were wounded. The battle for Mount Suribachi, the raising of the flag that became one of the most iconic images of World War II. All of it depended on coordinated communication between units. And that communication depended on men speaking a language their government had tried to erase. The code talkers participated in every major marine operation in the Pacific: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Guam, Bougainville, Saipan, and Okinawa. They waited ashore under machine gun fire, transmitted coordinates while shells exploded around them, and kept American forces connected when every second mattered. But they also faced dangers that other Marines didn't. Japanese forces quickly realized that Marines with radios were high-value targets. They couldn't break the code, but they could kill the men transmitting it. Code talkers were specifically targeted by Japanese snipers and artillery. Several were wounded. 13 were killed in action. There was another danger, one that came from their own side. Early in the war, before all Marine units had been educated about the Code Talker program, several Navajo Marines were nearly shot by other Americans who mistook them for Japanese soldiers. Chester Nez recalled almost being killed on Angkor Island when 2 Army soldiers captured him and his fellow Code Talker, convinced they were enemy infiltrators. Only the intervention of a Marine officer who understood the program saved their lives. When the war ended in August 1945, the Code Talkers came home. But unlike other veterans who could share their stories, celebrate their service, and receive public recognition, the Code Talkers were ordered to remain silent. The Navajo Code was still classified. The military believed it might be needed for future conflicts. So Chester Nez returned to New Mexico and didn't tell anyone what he had done. Thomas Begay went home to Arizona and kept the secret. Hundreds of Navajo veterans carried their wartime experiences locked inside, unable to share with their families, their communities, even their own children. The silence lasted 23 years. In 1968, the Navajo Code was finally declassified. Even then, public recognition came slowly. Many of the Code Talkers had died, taking their stories with them. Those who remained were elderly men, living quietly on the Navajo Nation, unknown to the general public. The irony was profound and painful. These men had used a language their government had tried to destroy. They'd been punished as children for speaking Navajo, told their culture was savage and their language worthless. Then, when America needed them, That same language became the most valuable military asset in the Pacific theater. After the war, they returned to a nation where Native Americans still faced discrimination, where they couldn't vote in some states, where they were denied service in restaurants and hotels. Chester Nez found work painting walls at a Veterans Administration hospital in Albuquerque. He worked there for 25 years, and few of his co-workers knew he was a war hero. Thomas Begay struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by the things he had seen and done in combat. He found some healing in traditional Navajo ceremonies, including the Enemy Way ritual designed specifically for warriors returning from battle. Gradually, recognition came. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th as National Navajo Code Talkers Day. In 1992, a permanent exhibit honoring the Code Talkers was installed at the Pentagon. But it wasn't until 2001 that the original 29 received the recognition they deserved. On July 26, 2001, President George W. Bush presented congressional gold medals to the surviving members of the original 29. Only 5 were still alive to receive their medals in person: Chester Nez, Lloyd Oliver, Alan Dale June, John Brown Jr., and Michael Nez. The other 24 received their medals posthumously. President Bush spoke at the ceremony. Today we recall a story that all Americans can celebrate and every American should know. It is a story of ancient people called to serve in a modern war. It is a story of one unbreakable oral code of the Second World War, messages traveling by field radio on Iwo Jima, in the very language heard across the Colorado Plateau centuries ago. Above all, it's a story of young Navajos who brought honor to their nation and victory to their country. Chester Nez lived to be 93 years old. He spent his final decades traveling the country, speaking at schools, museums, and military events, ensuring that the story of the Code Talkers would not be forgotten. In 2011, he published his memoir, Code Talker, the first and only memoir by one of the original Navajo Code Talkers of World War II, written with co-author Judith Shees Avila. In one of his last interviews, conducted just 10 days before his death in June 2014, Chester reflected on his service. "I am very proud to be one of those people who helped out during World War II. Our country needed us, and we answered. In Navajo, always faithful means that you love and support everything that America stands for." He also had a final message for active duty Marines. "All you Marines out there, wherever you are, come home in one piece. As Corporal Chester Nez, I say to you guys that are out there, Semper Fidelis, take care and come home." Chester Nez died on June 4th, 2014. He was the last surviving member of the original 29. His funeral in Albuquerque drew Marines, Native American honor guards, and veterans from across the country. He was buried in his Marine dress blues at the Santa Fe National Cemetery. Thomas Begay is still alive as of 2025, one of only 2 surviving Navajo Code Talkers. He is approximately 101 years old, though exact records of his birth are unclear. The other survivor is Peter McDonald, who is 97. Both men continue to share their stories when health permits, determined that the sacrifice of their fellow Code Talkers will be remembered. While the Navajo code talkers are the most famous Native American contribution to World War II, they were far from the only one. Native Americans served in all branches of the military, in all theaters of war. Approximately 44,000 Native American men and women served during World War II, representing about 13% of the entire Native American population at the time. This was the highest per capita contribution of any ethnic group in America. The Comanche served as code talkers in Europe, including during the D-Day invasion. 14 Comanche men developed their own code using their tribal language, operating with the 4th Infantry Division through France and Germany. The Choctaw, who had pioneered code talking in World War I, continued their service in World War II. The Hopi, Meskwaki, Tlingit, Creek, and Cherokee also served as code talkers, using their languages to secure military communications. Native Americans also served in conventional combat roles. Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona, was one of the 6 Marines who raised the flag on Iwo Jima in the famous photograph. He struggled with post-traumatic stress and alcohol addiction after the war, dying in 1955 at age 32. His story became a symbol of the challenges many Native American veterans faced when returning home. Native American women served as well, though their contributions have been even less recognized. Women like Minnie Spotted Wolf, a Blackfeet woman from Montana, became one of the first Native American women to enlist in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. Others served as Army and Navy nurses, factory workers in defense plants, and in countless support roles that kept the war effort running. The Navajo Code was never broken, not during World War II, not during the Korean War when it was used again, not even with modern computer analysis. It remains the only spoken military code in modern history that was never compromised. But the legacy of the code talkers extends far beyond cryptography. Their service fundamentally challenged American assumptions about Native Americans. The same government that had tried to erase native languages, that had forced children into boarding schools to kill the Indian and save the man, that had denied Native Americans full citizenship rights until 1924, that government had to admit it needed those languages and cultures to survive. The code talkers proved that diversity is a strength, not a weakness, that cultural differences can be strategic assets, that the languages and traditions that survived genocide and oppression contain wisdom and value that the dominant culture doesn't possess. Today, Native American languages are still endangered. Of the approximately 300 native languages spoken in North America before European contact, fewer than 200 survive, and most of those are spoken by fewer than 1,000 people. Navajo is one of the few that remains relatively healthy, with about 170,000 speakers, but it's still declining, especially among younger generations. The story of the code talkers reminds us what we lose when languages die. We don't just lose words. We lose entire ways of understanding the world. We lose connections to history, to land, to community. We lose strategic capabilities that we might desperately need in the future. The Navajo Code Talkers Museum opened in 2019 in Tuba City, Arizona, on the Navajo Nation. It preserves artifacts, photographs, and recorded interviews with code talkers. But the most important preservation happens when people learn these stories, when they understand what the code talkers accomplished, and what they sacrificed. Chester Nez stood on that beach at Guadalcanal in November 1942, radio in one hand, rifle in the other, speaking words that his teachers had tried to beat out of him. Those words, transmitted over radio waves that carried across the Pacific, helped bring an empire to its knees. The Navajo Code. Talkers proved that sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't the ones you can see. They're not guns or bombs or ships. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is a language that survives, a culture that endures, a people who refuse to forget who they are, even when the world tells them they should. From the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima to the jungles of Guadalcanal, from Tarawa to Okinawa, Navajo voices spoke across the chaos of war. Those voices saved thousands of American lives. Those voices helped win the Pacific War. Those voices, which had been silenced in childhood, became the sound of victory. Approximately 400 Navajo men served as code talkers during World War II. 13 gave their lives in service. Every single one earned the right to be remembered not just as warriors, but as men who turned persecution into purpose, who transformed a tool of oppression into a weapon of liberation, who proved that the languages and cultures America tried to destroy were actually essential to its survival. Their code was never broken. Their courage was never questioned. Their legacy will never be forgotten. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every like helps YouTube share these forgotten stories with more people. Subscribe to Override War for more incredible true stories from World War II. And please, in the comments below, let us know where you're watching from and whether someone in your family served during the war. Share any stories or events from history you'd like us to cover. These real stories, these real heroes, deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us keep these memories alive.